Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read Bad Boy, a Memoir by Walter Dean Myers. This is a very fitting introduction to the phenomenal writer that is Walter Dean Myers. He was an accomplished children's author in particular. He passed in 2014, but his career spanned over 40 years. Bad Boy, a memoir, details his childhood up into kind of like the beginning stages of his writing career. He published his first book, Where Does the Day Go?, after winning a literature contest, which I believe was in 1969. Now, Bad Boy was geleased in 2001, and I was super surprised to know that it is actually a children's book. Not that it's not like gritty or anything, but usually when I hear it's a children's book, I expect to get like a dumbed down version of everything and everything kind of simplified. But I thought it was a very fitting, memoir, and it read just like any other notable figures memoir, and it was actually very good. I'm skipping to my review part, but I enjoyed this book. Now, it's set in the colorful world of Harlem in the 40s and the 50s, and I'm not saying colorful because of race, but just because the atmosphere of Harlem at that time period was very lively, and it's described as being a place where I don't want to say you can always find entertainment, but there were always kids outside playing. They had different shops and whatnot, and theaters and all types of stuff. So this was definitely a special time in Harlem, and it birthed a lot of very notable figures. And it's kind of cool to hear him talk about certain like neighbors that he had who would go on to accomplish great things or go on to become these people that we now idolize in whatever field that we're in. So that was pretty cool. When it comes to the style of this book, so with memoirs, obviously, there's a lot of personal reflection. It is a narrative of that person's life from their mouths most of the time. He opens up the book saying, each one of us is born with a history already in place. And this is in reference to the things that happened before us. So he gives us the backstory of his parents and their parents and how these families came to be one. He also explains what he calls his complex family ties. So he has a bit of a different family structure than what I would say some people will call normal. So let's start with his birth parents. So Mary Dolly Green passed when he was very young, but she was married to George Myers, who is his biological father. Now, George Myers was previously married to Florence Dean, and they had children together. Florence Dean, however, was married to, after George was married to Herbert Dean, and they ultimately ended up adopting Walter from his biological father. So when he refers to mom and dad, he's talking about the parents that raised him, Florence Dean and Herbert Dean, which are not related to him by blood. So that was pretty interesting. And I also wanted to pull that out to say that, in today's time period, and it's not even a specific generation, just the people living today, we sometimes romanticize the past and say, well, back in great grandma's days, they had a strong family structure and they had a 2-parent household and there wasn't no having kids outside of wedlock, and that wasn't the case here, but family wasn't a one fit all back then either. And so I think sometimes we give each other a very hard time when it comes to what raising a family and what having a healthy family looks like. But back then, there was a very heavy emphasis on extended family, and if I needed to send my kid to my cousins or my siblings or whatever's house for a summer, that was completely normal. And that's something that I've noticed with figures of this time period. I was recently reading Maya Angelou's book, and as well, it's like the same thing. Like the kids would kind of go with different family members for summer, maybe for a couple years. That was the norm back then. So I just wanted to point that out because, even though there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in this day and age, but there's still no specific way to raise, or there's no standard like family format, just take care of each other. Now, along with explaining his background, we also get a reference to his great great uncle, Lucas D. Dennis, who was enslaved in Virginia. This is important because we're talking about a child who grew up in the 40s and the 50s. Obviously, they're going to have closer ties to slavery than those of us living now. And he was able to track this information about Lucas D. Dennis through census data. So this is kind of just, to verify his ties to a specific area and his family as a whole, and paint a picture for the audience of where he came from, like what life he was born into. Now, another key reference here is books, and I find that they were almost used as symbols at times. So oftentimes when Walter would discuss, the events that are happening during a specific year, he would also talk about the types of books that he was discovering during that time period. And oftentimes the themes of those books really did reflect what he was going through in real life. So an example of that is The Stranger by Camus. I haven't read that one yet, so I'm not sure how to say that name. But this book was related to the topic of disengaging from emotions. And this happened to be discussed during the time when Walter was just having a tough time with school, and he was in his adolescent to early teenage years, and he was going back and forth to a physician's office for like psychological evaluations. And so it just goes to show you, this is not the only example, but it's either that we gravitate towards things that can kind of tell us the answer, in this case books, or they just kind of find us. But it's the whole idea that art imitates life, imitates art, it's a cycle. So I did like how that was brought in. Like, he would be discussing events that had happened during that day, and he would also, the next paragraph would be him talking about his reading that book and what he got from that book and his experiences with that. So now, literature is the strongest theme for this book. It's his most efficient form of communication as well. He had a tough time in his later teen years kind of communicating with his parents. And that was strange because when he was younger, even though those weren't his birth parents, he was very close with his mother, and he was able to hold, a healthy relationship with them. But for whatever reason, he just wasn't able to reconcile the different relationships among him, whether it be friendships or classmates or whatever may have you. And to add on top of that, he had speech problems. So literally speaking wasn't a good way for him to talk to people or communicate with people, because they couldn't understand him. He had, some type of speech impediment. Now, throughout the book, we get to see the stages of how a reader can turn into a writer. So it starts with his mother reading him magazines, and that was kind of their, mother and son time when the father was away working and the two older siblings were out of the house doing whatever. That was a special time period and a memory that he could hold close. Then that kind of flows into him going to Bible school and studying the Bible. And again, this reinforces the whole idea that you're reading words, you're getting meaning from words, and you're living your life by those words. To once he gets older, he's reading in school now. And then he gets a hold of some comic books. So recreationally, he's reading them as well. And even though those are not that's not considered like literature, that's still a story. That's still a narration. And I'm pretty sure that the comics had, some type of talking going on. It wasn't all artwork, but it's still, a story to be told. Then later on in school, he ends up getting into speech therapy classes where he's able to articulate his thoughts. This is kind of around like the very early stages of him becoming a writer, because when you're writing, it's one thing to be able to write a story that you understand and you identify with, and you're able to pull the message from that story. But if you can't write it in a way that everyone else can get that message, then it's not really, it's not important because it only means something to you. So I would argue that this is kind of the beginnings of him understanding how to reach other people, because he would often say he didn't understand why people couldn't understand him when he was talking, because it made perfect sense for him. He sounded clear to himself, but other people couldn't understand him. And so this is like the beginnings of the foundation of being a writer. And then he would spend more and more time at the library because it was free and he could read however many books he wanted to. He would take all suggestions from the library and he would just read everything, read all the time. And that was just his thing that he would do. Then in school, we're getting into his older years here. We're getting into like the 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade. He would start writing poetry in school, as required by the English class. And this is where we see that English, that was really the class that kind of kept him in school for so long. He wasn't ever fully engaged in school. There was a point where it just kind of wasn't working for him anymore, but he would go to English class because he enjoyed reading the books and getting suggestions from his teacher, and he also enjoyed writing the poems and the short stories, and that was his thing, and he was capable of that. And then outside of school, he would start writing poetry about Harlem, and so he started trying to write like fictional stories or poetry about what was going on around him. And he found that to be quite difficult because for him, it was just Harlem, it's just home. How can you find a story in that? Like, how can you find a creative story? Again, this is all the beginning stages of being a writer and seeing the world through that lens. So after he kind of was finished with school, he ended up using his reading skills to his benefit while he was in the Army, and he found that in the workforce especially, he did have an edge on other applicants because he was able to comprehend at a much higher, rate than anyone else. And then, of course, we get towards the end where he is writing through multiple rejections in order to get to success. So the last few pages detail him starting to write again after he had kind of, had his bout with like the real workforce and the 9-to-5s and stuff. And he would write and he would send stuff off and get rejected, and he would keep writing until ultimately he won that contest. So that whole those bullet points there, it really does detail how he started out as someone in the audience, someone who just enjoyed reading other people's thoughts. And now it turns into, over years, a very not long process, but necessary process to turn him into the legend that he is now, or was. One thing to keep in mind here was he also said that most of his life revolved around school and church. So again, that's that foundation when he was younger, Bible school, and then going to school. And even though he wasn't really connected to, like, let's say a math class, he still was able to first of all, show his intelligence, because he was very intelligent, but also stick with the English class and maintain a connection with the teachers, because they would always, notice that he's reading like a lot. He's reading a lot more than other kids, and he's also writing a lot more than other kids. There was a lasting impact of teachers, the school, and the discipline that they had on his character. And I think for the benefit, because one quote that kind of stuck with me out of all of this is that one teacher said to him while he was getting in trouble for skipping school, "Whatever you do, don't stop writing." And that's something that came around to him towards the beginning years of his writing career, where he had kind of took a break, and he was like, he remembered what that teacher has said to him, even when he was getting in trouble for being a quote unquote bad student. she still was like, listen, keep writing, keep doing it, keep pushing forward, because it's something you're passionate about and it's something that you're capable of. The second theme here, surprisingly, was depression. The Dean household all had their own bouts with depression. First came Herbert Dean, who's the father. He lost his brother, and that sent him into a year-long depression. And this was a time where he disengaged from his family completely, and it impacted them and their relationship going forward. Florence Dean, a few years later, just from everyday life and financial struggles, had her dealings with depression, and she fell into kind of this era of gambling. And this is also when she started turning to alcohol more and more. Walter, he had a difficult time finding his way as an adolescent. And with the whole school thing, like I mentioned before, just battling with who am I and what am I here to do, and not seeing any reflection in the people, the kids around him. He just didn't have a way. And this led to him being deemed disturbed by the school and the psychologist, because he had a bad temperament, but he had a very high IQ score. And he said in the book that basically if he would have had a low IQ and had that bad behavior, they just would have said he was rebellious and that he didn't know better. But because they knew he was intelligent and he was capable of thinking on a higher level, they deemed him disturbed. Really what we find though is that in the Dean household, the helplessness that we feel in life when things like this happen promoted a very deep sadness for this family. And it sounded like, I'll have to probably do some more research, but it sounded like by the time we got to the end of this story, at least, that they had each kind of dealt with that in their own way, and they weren't necessarily suffering that bad anymore. But I'll have to read more on him. So the one thing I did not include as a theme is the whole bad boy rebellious thing. The reason is, I don't think he was bad. I really feel like he was just a child figuring out life like the rest of us. I do think that kids do stupid things a lot. It's just human nature to do stupid things, and it's better to do it when you're a kid than when you're an adult and you have to, pay your own bills and stuff. But that's how they learn what not to do in adulthood. So I wouldn't necessarily call him bad. I understand why he titled it Bad Boy, because he wasn't I'll say this, he wasn't disruptive, but he also wasn't like the star student that he could have been. So there's that, but that I didn't want to add that because I don't think he was a bad kid. I don't think he was a bad person or anything. He just was figuring it out. So when it comes to my personal review, I really do think that, first of all, this is the story of an evolution of an author. And that's something that I personally relate to. So I enjoyed it far more than I thought I was going to. And there was a point towards the end where I started tearing up, which is absolutely ridiculous. I know it wasn't a sad book. There wasn't a sad ending. But when I heard him talk about how he eventually got to interact with James Baldwin and Langston Hughes, like I'm getting a little teary-eyed now, because that's crazy to see where he came from as a child. And I felt like I was watching him grow up throughout this book, and to see he's standing next to the people that understand him. And there was an interaction between him and James Baldwin where they kind of touched on that, where it's like some people, and I think that with writers, and this is being reinforced every day that, I keep living, I'm starting to understand that sometimes we're just not all on the same wavelength, and I can't necessarily communicate and forge connections with people like how other normal people do. And so I heavily relate to written communication as my best form of communication. It's something that I saw in myself and in Walter when I was reading this. So I teared up at the end. So this book was definitely amazing. I think it's a reader's paradise as well. So while he's discussing all of the books that he found in school all of the books that he read in the library. He's actually giving you the title and the authors of the books and the short stories and the poems. So I'm over here writing down everything. So I have a whole new list to add on to my TBR of books that they were teaching, the kids back in the 40s and the 50s. Some people probably know this, but I think that the curriculum for English has certainly changed in the past, 60 years? So there's a lot of books I didn't recognize. So if you're someone who likes to get other references from accomplished authors, this is a great book as well for that. I would like, and I don't know if this exists, I'll have to look it up, but if any one of his surviving family members could put together all of his old writings and put that into a book and kind of sell that as a companion piece for this, I think that would be really cool. Of course, everything's not like when you're writing first starting out, everything's not going to be great. It's probably all kind of not good, but I would love to see that alongside him discussing his thoughts and his feelings as he's writing these things. I would love to see the beginnings of his poems and the short stories that he made when he was a child, and how his writing has evolved up until this point. I just think that would be really cool. I don't know if everyone else would, but stuff like that is interesting to me. So is this a reread? Yeah, this is staying on my shelf for forever. It's also a short read. So if you're someone that likes to, let's say like a Saturday morning, wake up early, you can knock this book out in 2 hours. It's 200 pages and it's very small. So the pages are very small. It's really not that, it's not a tough read at all. So yeah, definitely a reread for writers, especially. I think even if you're not a creative writer, you can understand and relate to the journey that he had. And I think like the problems that he was having in school and how he wasn't really seeing a path for himself as a writer. He didn't know like what that was. He didn't know how to get there, but he ultimately got there. So my only takeaway here is that good writers are formed via an uncomfortable learning period. And let me tell you something, that uncomfortable learning period is life. Okay? And they don't tell you that, but once you decide to actively see the world as a writer, it's tough because it's almost like you are now responsible for your voice being heard and for it to be heard accurately. I think that's the toughest thing for me as a writer. I want people to get out of my writing what I want them to get out of it. And so sometimes it's hard to get that message across, and I have to learn to write in a way that people will get my message the way I want them to get it. So yeah, that's it. Very short book, short review. I have a few things on my immediate review list. I just finished Agatha Christie's Murder in Mesopotamia. I'm going to read Halloween Party next. I'm also in the process of reading Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. That will probably be the next review, if not the review after that. Rose That Grew from the Concrete, Tupac. That's on my list. And then The Wire, All the Pieces Matter. I'll be reading that as well. Also, there was a new Bridgerton book released, and I said I wasn't going to read any more of the books about the siblings, but the book that was just released is the one about Queen Charlotte. So I think I'm going to get that and read that before I binge the series. So that review will probably be coming in the next month or so. So yeah, a lot to look forward to. If you have any suggestions, drop it in the comment box. And that's it. I'll see you all next week. Thank you for tuning in.